I had known what that song was going to be used for when I filled out that survey, I probably would have put something different. Just gonna admit that now. In fact, this entire talk is about music, so yeah, I probably would have timed it to that. So we're just gonna pretend I did that. So when thinking about what kind of talk I wanted to give at Nordic.js, I was like pretty excited because I know that this is the home of Spotify, and I really do like music quite a bit. And a fun fact about me, besides the names of my cats, is that every year my Spotify Wrapped reveals that I am a massive nerd. I think we're probably all nerds here. But my form of nerd is that I am literally the #1 listener of Monks of the Notre Dame Abbey on Spotify. They sent me an email last year to be like, hey, are you okay? Over 50% of the minutes in a year, I listen to classical music. And I mean, the secret is that it's while I sleep, and my cats really like it. But yeah, so I figured who better to give a talk about ARIA than somebody who really knows ARIA. So if you're not familiar, ARIA, lowercase, is the self-contained little jingle that every opera has. They're in cantatos, ariados. They date way back to the medieval music of the 14th century. They became pretty common in Baroque operas in the 17th century. So if you can't name one opera composer, you probably think of Mozart. And if you can't name one opera, you can probably sing the jingle from one opera that he has written, and that is the aria. But you're probably like, hey, over that last break, this didn't suddenly become an opera hall. I'm pretty sure this is a JavaScript conference. So you're probably not expecting me to talk about that aria. You're expecting me to talk about aria, capital. And that's how we're going to differentiate them, is just saying it really loud. And that's the only difference, and that's my talk. No. So ARIA is accessible, rich internet applications, and it's the attributes that allow us to add accessibility to our dynamic components. So behind the scenes, all of your HTML is being compiled and using all of these ARIA attributes and adding them dynamically and programmatically. It's what brings a lot of accessibility to the web, but it's also this thing that we can apply to our own custom components that allows us to make our web applications more accessible to people with disabilities. So, if we haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Emma Twersky. I am a developer relations engineer at Google. I care deeply and work excessively on accessibility, and I also love a good aria. So, today we're going to talk about how those two words, aria and aria, really aren't that different. And they're both about pattern matching and pattern finding, and I think they relate in a really beautiful way that makes them both a little bit more accessible and easy to think about. And so since we're talking about ARIA on the web, I'm going to start with the most scary graph of all of the ARIA that exists, which is just a massive web of ARIA, right? This is terrifying. And this is every interconnected and relational attribute between every ARIA role and every ARIA attribute. This is a handy-dandy guide that I made that I refer to often and that every time I look at really scares me and freaks me out. But if we dig into a specific spoke and look at these relationships, and if we just dig into that one highlighted one, we can see that it really starts to look like a tree. And the accessibility tree on the web, which is how we're navigating websites with accessibility services like screen readers, ends up looking a lot similar, right? So this is all this massive inheritance pattern that we learn when we write our JavaScript, right? We write these classes, we think about inheritance, and ARIA is doing a lot of similar things. So in this talk, I want to talk about how my team is working to find organization in the chaos of ARIA and think about programmatic ways that we can add automated systems and think about how we can make ARIA less of something that like you individually have to say, like, I have a custom component, I'm gonna probably add some ARIA to this, I'm just gonna like throw some on and hope that it makes it more accessible. And think about how there's actually rules underlying like how you write your ARIA that they're not well documented, right? Like this is sort of an exploration of like, is ARIA really so unknown, or are there patterns that we can pull out similar to the jingles of like an opera? So to do that, my first introduction to the lowercase ARIA was on piano. And clearly, this is the zoomed-in face of a very focused future ARIA developer. So we're all going to be this face. And I built a very janky web app. So if you scan this and get out your phones right now, we're all going to become an orchestra for the rest of this talk. And you can go to this hyperlink. It's gregorian.netlify.app. And you're gonna get a really janky piano application. And the way this is gonna work is if you have it open, I'm gonna give you a note to play, like C, and I give you permission to turn on your volume for your phone. I know that's rare, and I'm actually gonna pull it up with my screen. So if I gave you like a C to play, you would hear it. If I gave you like if I gave you a C sharp, you could play that. Okay, I'm starting to hear it. You can turn up your volume a little bit. If I gave you a D flat, that's the same thing as a C sharp. That was just a trick. And yeah, so that's how it's gonna work. So our first aria we're going to play is La Donna Immobile. I'm going to try and play along again. We will see how this works. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, so if you've recognized that at all, that is how far my skills ever went as a pianist. I am very bad, and it sounds like we're all probably at the same level. So that makes me feel a lot better. I promise I'm a lot better developer than I am pianist. So La Donna Immobile translates to woman is fickle. And I'm gonna change that to aria is fickle. And the programmatic rule we're gonna get out of this is try not to use aria. So I know that this is an aria talk. This is about like programmatic ways to write your aria better. And the first one is like aria is really fickle and just try not to use it. Aria, the best aria is no aria, and we really want to save our aria for places where HTML can't already do what we're trying to do. So dynamic content, things where maybe the designers that have given you some sort of control system that doesn't work. But if there's HTML that already does what you're trying to do, don't reinvent the wheel. So native HTML is really fickle, right? If I have a button and I try and give it aria roles of maybe like an image, the button is gonna get really confused when it tries to compile because it's like, I know I'm a button, but you're telling me I'm an image. I don't know what to do with myself, right? So we're not trying to override anything that has existing support. The existing support exists and is way better than anything that you're going to try and do, right? So our first rule is if you search the MVP of this app in your code editor, there's not gonna be anything there. There's a really great study by WebAIM that found that in over 1 million homepages, homepages with aria present saw 41% more errors than those without aria. So a lot of times what you think you're doing by trying to add aria to make it better is actually making it worse. So again, aria is fickle. That entire opera is about fickle people. And really at the end of the day, we're just gonna try not to use it. Places where it's not fickle, again, is if there's no native HTML element, A pop-up is a really good example. Dialogues, things like that. We don't have native across browser support yet. Or if the element exists, but the support isn't fully there. And then finally, again, those custom controls. So if there isn't an HTML element for it, go ahead and use your ARIA at your own will. Again, a pop-up is a really great example. Like every website is adding pop-ups these days. You can't escape them as much as I try. And there's no good ARIA, or there's no good HTML element for you to add your pop-up natively, right? There's no like pop-up tag in HTML. So that's a really good place where like ARIA makes a lot of sense. So we're going to continue forward with that example. So programmatically, the first thing that we're adding to our linting on my teams is that we're going to check for all ARIA usage, and we're just going to say, hey, like maybe back off using this, especially if it's on something like a button HTML tag that we know has support. So anything that is known semantic HTML, we're going to warn if you're trying to add any ARIA attributes to it, because it's probably going to make things worse, not better. Okay, so get your phones back out for our opera, and we're going to play our next opera, which is Bizet's Song of the Toreador. I like the singing. The singing is much better. I enjoy that people know these already. Okay, so 1, 2, 1, 2. Oops. Yeah. Yep, that was it. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, so that is, again, I promise I'm a better JavaScript developer. You are a better pianist than me. But it's fun to do something interactive, right? Okay. So this entire aria is about seduction. Like this plays as the character is being seduced in the opera Carmen, and this poor fellow like gets seduced away, and like it's a bad story for him. And so what we're going to learn here is don't let aria role seduce you. Again, this is this thing where like we are like, like I just want this to act as what it's supposed to be, so I'm just going to add an aria role to it, and that's going to make it so much better. And again, we're falling into that like aria's fickle place where it's not the right thing to do. Don't go that direction. So again, every single box on here is an aria role. So we have tons of roles to work with. And the thing is, like, we can gray out half of this as things you shouldn't be touching. Like, these roles exist, but secretly the reason they exist is because HTML is trying to use them themselves, the browser is trying to use them. All of these things that are programmatically smarter than me as a developer are trying to use them. And every time I add it to my app, it's actually making it worse. So we have all of these boxes. Each one represents a different aria role. They're all inheriting from each other. And we have 6 different types. So we have document structure roles. These are things that provide structural descriptions. Most of these you shouldn't use because these are the things that semantic HTML is being added for, right? So these are like, I don't know, like groups, document, I can't read my screen, block quote, like all of these things there's already HTML for, and the HTML is using these roles, and so I shouldn't touch them. So I've personally categorized them into the sections I believe they fit in, which is okay, no, 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 and never. And the things in never are things that there's well-supported HTML for. The things in no, 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 there's like ways to do it with HTML that you really shouldn't be adding these roles yourself. And then the okay ones are the ones that like we should go to the browsers and be like, hey, why haven't you given us HTML specs for toolbar? Like, where's the toolbar HTML? So it's okay to use those ones. But for the most part, let them be programmatic. Again, we have some okay ones, but otherwise, like, I've removed the rest. There's some caveats on ones, right? You can use presentation if you're actually like hiding it with an aria hidden equals true, but that should only be if it's not going to be interactable, and it's just like something that's hidden on the page that you're not actually wanting to ever focus on. The next ones are widget roles. These are like exactly the same as the document structure ones, except that these are where JavaScript comes in, because these are all things that have JavaScript interactions as well as being a document structure. So these are things like buttons, things you can click, things like radios, all of that stuff is going to be a widget. And again, a lot of this we already have in HTML, so you really shouldn't use. So again, with my categories, like I can cut it down to really just a few that we're ever going to touch, and everything else I'm just going to gray out. Landmark roles are this like really fun ARIA role category where they're at the top of the page. So like, you know, you ng new or you start a new React app or anything, you're going to get a main, and you're going to put all your stuff in that main, and it's going to be really confusing if you add another main, because then I don't know which one is the actual main. So landmark roles are things that at the top level you get one of, you only get that one, and for the most part, again, there's already HTML for it. There's some ones that make sense, right? Like you can use complementary to add a complementary, things like that. But a really good exercise is like if you take the structure of your web page, you can break them up into your landmarks. You should be able to do this really simply. It should be really high level. It should be really easy. You know, like the Spotify app, I think, is a pretty good example of like there's very few things on there at the landmark level, and there's only one of them. You know, that app you're looking at right now, there's just a main. That's it. And so for the most part, we're going to cross out a lot of them, but they're OK. Next, we have live regions. This is where ARIA roles actually start to get good. So these are things where we want to define elements that have dynamically changing content. And this is really important, right? Because if I try and submit a form because I'm trying to like book a ticket to go to Nordic.js, and I forgot to fill out my address, and there's a new error on the screen that has my errors that like I need an address, but I'm still focused somewhere else on the page on that submit. If I am a user who is blind and is using a screen reader, and I just keep tapping the submit form and I just keep not getting a success, I'm going to be really confused. So like alert is really useful, right? Because alert is going to allow us to, at the dynamic content change, alert the user that something's changed, even if it's not what's currently focused. So these are actually really great. Similar with window rules, these are things like dialogues, like that dreaded pop-up, things like that. So again, things that exist on the document window that are sub-windows to the main window. And these are going to be OK, but there's not a lot of them for a reason. And then finally, we have abstract roles. And these are the ones that like people probably don't even know exist. And this is because these are things that you absolutely should never use, because they purely are there as like an abstract pattern to inherit from. So if we look at, again, that tree, like these are things that are high level that we're abstracting from, that we're inheriting other role types from, but these are only for browsers to use because browsers are using them to know the like groupings of ARIA roles, and you should absolutely never touch them. So again, like no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. If you have an ARIA role like on a button, get rid of it. So again, from our types, we're going to programmatically do a few things. We're going to, number one, look for ARIA role in our HTML. So these are in your, like, your linters, whatever you're using to test HTML. We're adding these as a linter into our language service. And so at development time, we're going to say, like, hey, you just added an ARIA role. Is it valid? Like, is that even an ARIA role that you can add? Did you misspell landmark and say landmerk or meerkat or I don't know, whatever? So typos, really easy to check for. But then we're going to go one step further and say, is the HTML element that you put it on compatible with that ARIA role? So did you add any sort of ARIA role other than button or presentation to your button element? That's an error. You're not going to be able to compile that. We can give developer guidance at that time of why you probably shouldn't be doing that. And then we're going to warn for well-supported roles. So again, if you're adding a role like any of those abstract roles, we're going to error. If there are any of the things that were in like my no category, we're going to give you a warning for like, hey, like you should probably look up that ARIA role because like you really shouldn't be using that ever. So if we take all of those ARIA rules, we can gray out a bunch of them, and then we can do one step further, and again, with those landmark rules, we know that there should only be one. We can check if there's more than one, and we know that they have to be at that top level. So if they're anywhere else, we can throw an error. So anything circled in yellow, we can also error for, and we have a lot less ARIA rules. So the graph becomes a little bit more or less nonsensical. Okay, time to get out your phones. We have another ARIA. And this is Bizet's habanera. And this is probably the one, if you haven't heard anything before or my piano skills are so bad you have no idea what you're listening to, this is the one that you're going to recognize. So 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, that was really bad. Okay, did we at least get the feeling of what that sounds like? Yeah, thank you. I'm a great pianist. This is a great idea. Okay, so this is another one from Carmen. This is like the most famous, if you haven't heard the previous arias, because I'm such a bad pianist. And this is basically just a talk where I self-roast myself. You've probably heard this one, like Beyonce sang it in a Pepsi advertisement for the Super Bowl in the US. The Muppets have their own version of it. Like this is everywhere. So this one is all about like popularity and discoverability. So for this, we're going to talk about ARIA labels and how they should be like mass-produced to be the most discoverable. So all interactive elements have to have an accessible name. ARIA label is probably the thing that you deal with the most, and it works like this. It like goes down this waterfall where it tries to either name or describe an element, and it does that by first trying to say, hey, is there child content? Cool, I'm just gonna read that, like that's the label. This would be like a home link. Next, if it doesn't have that, like you know, this is a close button that just has an X inside of it, then it's gonna look for the actual ARIA label. If it doesn't have that, then a great example of that would be like Twitter, all your social media tags, stuff like that. Like this is a great example of when to use ARIA label. If you're not gonna use that, then you can use labeled by, form controls, and again, just continuing to go down that list. And what you're doing here is inside of that, you're gonna do 5 things. You're gonna convey the function and purpose, not the form. So if it's an X, you're not gonna say X button, you're gonna say close button, because that's what it's doing. Next, you're going to put the most important word first, so it's not gonna be button close, it's gonna be close button. Next, you're gonna be concise, so you're not gonna be like a long sentence that says, this is going to close your button, something like that. It's just gonna be close button. You're also not going to actually have the role name in it, so it's not gonna be close button, it's just gonna be close. And then most important, you're going to start with a capital letter. And this is something that we can programmatically do that we're not doing right now. Like no linters are doing this. And we're gonna check that it's not a sentence, that it doesn't have a period at the end. That doesn't work well with localization, with screen readers, all of these things. And we're gonna make sure it starts with a capital letter, because capital letters do way better in localization processes across browsers, across localization support, so that close has a better chance of being close across all the languages you support and not like classe accidentally. So programmatically, we're going to check for all of your ARIA labels. We're gonna confirm that they're valid there. And then we're gonna check that they're capitalized, that they're not sentences, and that there's no like period at the end. And then we're gonna warn for any of those cases, as well as if they're empty. Okay, we have 2 more. So everybody get out your phones, and you can pick which one you do, the hard one or the easy one on top, because this is going to be a duet. So 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, I was pretty close on that one, honestly. So this is a duet, and that's because ARIA works really well in pairs. Right, so all these things we've talked about separately. We've talked about like roles and labels. And at the end of the day, most of ARIA are attributes. And most of those attributes work based on the role that that element has. So there's all these different types of attributes. I don't really care about going through all of them. But the point is that ARIA is relational, right? So each one of these boxes represents a role. And everything inside of it are all of the attributes that are allowed to be on that specific role, as well as anything that it inherits from. So all those abstract roles that have all of their attributes, anything that's like inheriting from that that's lower down in the tree also gets those attributes, plus any that it adds. And the cool thing about this is where it like actually becomes sort of an abstract class pattern. And this is where ARIA gets really programmatic, because I can know, based on my role, what attributes I should have, what attributes I shouldn't have, and what attributes I must have. And so we can actually create like a really cool graph. This is basically it in like pretty not code form of anything that I can or can't have based on the role. So if I know my role, at compile time, I can look at my attributes and I can make a judgment call of whether or not that's correct. So there's like a really cool duet between any sort of attribute, any like ARIA dash star, whatever that thing is, it's gonna be an attribute, and my ARIA role, which is like that thing we talked about at the beginning that sort of decides what the HTML is gonna be treated as. So if I like dig down into one example of this, I can see that like a checkbox, to come over and look. Like a checkbox and a radio button both have like the checked attribute, right? Like ARIA checked is applicable to both of those, but they both actually inherit from widget. So they get anything that widget can do. And those all inherit all the way from that big blue box, which is all the sort of general ARIA attributes that can be on anything, right? So like label, ARIA label is a great example. It can be on anything. So we're gonna do some checks here. So I have my ARIA checked, and I'm gonna do 3 different checks. Number 1, the most easy, I'm gonna check that the attribute name is valid. So is ARIA checked a valid attribute for HTML to even have in my linter? ARIA checked is great. Let's say it said ARIA like chicked with an I instead or something, some typo. At development time, like as I'm typing that in my code editor, my language service can be like, hey, that's not a word. And I know it's not a word because you're using the ARIA dash prefix, and I know that those are special, and I'm gonna check right away and say like, you misspelled this isn't gonna do what you think it's gonna do. So we know that checked works, we're gonna move on. So now that we know that checked is valid, we're gonna look at the value type. So we have a mass tree, again, of all of the different value types that are allowed for all of my different allowed attributes. And we know that for checked, I have these tokens that are allowed, so it's not just a Boolean, but I can have true, false, mixed, and undefined. And I know that true is valid, so I'm gonna let this pass. But let's say I accidentally put like null or something, right? Like I can warn as you're developing, as you're writing that code with my linter, like, hey, that's not gonna work. And then we get to the really fun part, which is where I think ARIA becomes a lot less scary at development time if you can guide your developers through this process. And you can say, okay, I know the inferred role type is a button, but I'm seeing an ARIA checked here, and I can see from my map here that button doesn't have ARIA checked, and nothing it inherits from has ARIA checked, because you can't check a button. And so I know with my linter, as I'm developing, before getting to runtime, that this is not gonna do what I think it's gonna do, right? Like ARIA is this weird hidden thing where it's probably not gonna throw errors if you throw the wrong ARIA on your HTML. So you end up with all of this ARIA in your code that's not actually doing what you think you're gonna do, because you can't error for it, right? It just is like, I don't know, checked is a thing, but this doesn't work. So at runtime, we're actually gonna say, hey, check doesn't work. A really great stretch goal of this, but you know, on checked box it does, is the point. A really great stretch goal of this is alt, right? Like alt text on images. I know that the image ARIA type is going to be ARIA role image. I know that there is this thing called alt text on it that's an ARIA attribute. And I can go one step further from my image by not just saying that alt is allowed, but it's required. So programmatically, we're going to check for valid ARIA names. We're going to check that the value type is true. We're going to check that the combination works. And we're even going to go ahead and say not only does that not work, but you're missing these ones that are required. OK, I have one more. No, I don't. OK, so going through my recommendations, number one, ARIA is fickle. Try not to use it. If you are going to use it, make sure that ARIA role doesn't seduce you, that you're only using the roles that you should, and that you're using them wisely. Check that the way you're writing your ARIA label is accessible and internationalizable. Check for capitalization. We're going to verify that you're using it in the correct way. And then do the really cool thing of checking everything we talked about and how they work together. So does the role and the attribute work together? And can we verify that in a more programmatic way? And please, for my own piano skills and the piano skills of me as a very young child, love ARIA, either ARIA or ARIA, and go write better ARIA. And I'm looking forward to my Spotify Wrapped this year. So thank you so much. The slides are here. And I'd love to talk after.